So to tell us more about 500 or interesting things that happened over the last 500 years, I present Jerry Juhnke. Please help me welcome Jerry.
Thank you, Laverne. I recognize you've been sitting for quite a while. If some of you need to get up and make it to the restroom, there,
Gotta come back.
that's appreciated if you do. That's perfectly understandable. I appreciate it if you do come back for that matter. Before I talk about Swiss William Mennonites, I'm not going to talk about genealogy, by the way. To me, that's a boring subject, but the history that goes with it can be very interesting. Before I talk about Swiss William Mennonites, I want to mention something that I found very interesting in my search for other genealogy information. Okay, that's fine, thank you. Does anyone know of a connection, and some of you I know do, with Pretty Prairie or Hutchinson and one of the Little Rascals, the old Our Gang comedy series? Yeah, a few of you do. Does anyone remember the Collinwood grain elevators? There was one in Hutchinson and one in Wishville. Right. This is the kind of stuff you run into sometimes. Lee Collinwood lived on a farm near Pretty Prairie. And along with his brother, owned grain elevators in many locations around Kansas. The Collinwood family was very wealthy. Lee died at about age 42 in a tragic grain elevator accident in the year 1940. In the mid-1950s, Lee's two daughters decided that they wanted to become movie stars. So the widowed mother and her daughters moved to Hollywood. During this time, one of the Collinwood daughters, named Diantha, had a blind date with Carl Switzer, better known as Alfalfa, in the Our Gang comedies. She eloped with Alfalfa to Las Vegas, and they were married in 1954. The couple then moved back to the farm near Pretty Prairie. The marriage was very rocky from the start. Alfalfa and Diantha separated very early in their marriage and then went back together again. The reconciliation may have happened at a time when Diantha realized that she was pregnant. Diantha gave birth to a son, but after less than 2 years of marriage, Diantha and Alfalfa divorced in 1956. Alfalfa was known to be very irresponsible. He tried to make a living as an actor, a bartender, and a hunting guide later in life, but was unsuccessful at these endeavors. He had numerous brushes with the law and 2 marriages and 2 divorces. He had some success as a professional dog breeder for a short period of time while he was living near Pretty Prairie. He worked in a Hutchinson sporting goods store. In 1959, just 4 years after the divorce from Diantha, Alfalfa died at age 31 from gunshot wound inflicted by a customer during an altercation over a $50 payment for training his dog. The judge later ruled his death as justifiable homicide because Alfalfa had drawn a knife on the customer. Diantha remarried. She died in 2004. She's buried in the Lone Star Cemetery about 3 miles from Pretty Prairie, where her parents and many of her other family members are also buried. Diantha's sister, Sally, moved to Wichita late in her life, where she died just 4 years ago in 2019. That's the story of Alfalfa. You're pretty rare. I do thank you for the opportunity to speak to this group. Swiss Millennium Mennonites have a very interesting history. I hope to share some of our stories and a little history that I have found particularly interesting. Most, but certainly not all of us, the history of our ancestors began as Anabaptists in the canton of Bern in Switzerland. To the northeast of the city of Bern, there is an area that consists of relatively inaccessible highlands and mountain fringes. This area is known as the Emmental Valley. It offers a great hiding place if you need one. Some of the Anabaptists that lived in the Emmental Valley very likely fled from some of the major Swiss cities to hide and avoid persecution. Some of our ancestors, with little doubt, came from these areas and may have originally come from the bigger cities. Existing negative sentiment against the government and various Catholic practices also only strengthened the more radical Anabaptist positions, and they quickly gained broad acceptance in many areas of Europe, particularly to the north in Germany, the Netherlands, and along the Baltic Sea, which included Prussia. Some of our ancestors came from these areas. We can't refer to ourselves as, our ancestors didn't refer to themselves as Mennonites in the early 1500s. Early in the Anabaptist movement, on January 12, 1536, a well-educated Catholic priest in Holland named Menno Simons renounced the Catholic faith and became a forceful leader of the Anabaptists in the Netherlands. His motto for a Christian life was the scripture from Corinthians, "Other foundations can no man lay than that which is laid in Christ Jesus." Some of those that wanted to bring harm to Menno Simons started to refer to the Anabaptists as Mennonites as a way to ridicule the Anabaptists. However, most Anabaptists were very pleased to see their former influential Catholic priest was now supporting the Anabaptists. As a result, they were quite willing to accept the name that was given to them by their enemies as a derogatory term. The name Mennonite probably came into general use around the year 1550 and was used by our ancestors around that time. Persecution of the Anabaptists began almost immediately and continued for many years. But our ancestors were fortunate that the worst persecution of Protestants and Anabaptists tended to occur outside of Switzerland in other parts of Europe. In fact, one historian states that during the early Protestant Reformation, compared to the rest of Europe, Switzerland remained a relative oasis of peace and prosperity. For our ancestors, some of the avoidance of the persecution may have been due to their remote location and the fact that a large percentage of the inhabitants in the canton of Bern were Protestants. At the height of the Anabaptist persecution in 1671, about 700 Mennonite refugees, including many Kragels, left Switzerland and moved to the Palatinate. The Millers, Schrogs, Zergers, and other families from Switzerland also lived in the Palatinate. One of the most significant Anabaptist religious developments for the Swiss Mennonites was the Amish schism in the late 1600s. This development split the Mennonite church in Switzerland, the Palatinate, and the Alsace. The controversy reached its climax when Jacob Amann, a Mennonite elder in Switzerland and the Alsace, insisted that all Mennonite ministers accept the newly introduced practice of Maido, which was the social and religious avoidance or shunning of excommunicated members. He believed that church members should not eat, do business with, or fraternize with excommunicated members. The almond Riest controversy has long been forgotten in Europe. There are no Amish in Europe, but over 20,000 baptized Amish live in the United States. The almond Riest controversy is particularly important for us because the Swiss Walloonian Mennonites that came from the Montbéliard, France community were Amish. You might be interested to know that the Montbéliard Mennonite Church is still in existence today. The church has a membership of about 230 people, 230 members, and an average attendance of about 300. Much of the early ancestry records and family history that we have today come from a church registry kept by this church from about 1750 to 1958. The Mennonite congregation of Montbéliard, or Montbédia in French, had its beginnings shortly after the Almond Schism in the very early 1700s. The city of Montbéliard is in France, but only 8 miles from the Swiss border. It is just west of the city of Basel and about 45 miles to the northwest of Bern. Ancestors from Montbéliard included the Flickingers, Grabers, Kaufmans, and Stuckies. It should be noted that in the Alsace, Montbéliard, and the Palatinate, proselytizing was forbidden. As a result, until we get to Russia, very few, if any, new members came into the Mennonite communities by the conversion of their non-Mennonite neighbors. In 2004, my wife and I made an unannounced visit to the Montbéliard church. We were met at the door by one of the church secretaries who immediately communicated that she did not speak much English and proceeded to close the door. I held up a sheet of paper with various traditional Swiss Walloonian Mennonite names on it. She looked at the paper, immediately invited us in, and said in fairly good English, "I will get you what you want." In a short period of time, she came back waving the old 1750 church book in her hands. She laid it on the table and said, "Here are your ancestors." Later, she took us to a church cemetery. Around the cemetery was a large wall, which she said, depending upon your perspective, the wall was either designed to keep the Mennonites in or the Catholics out. In 1762, Catherine II, who had German heritage and was more commonly called Catherine the Great, ascended to the throne in Russia. Russia had newly acquired land that is now in Ukraine and southern Poland. This territory was sparsely populated and very much neglected. She sent a special invitation to the Mennonites to come and settle in this area. Among the benefits she promised were religious freedom, military exemption, a tax exemption for 10 years, and ownership rights. Mennonites from the Netherlands, Prussia, Germany, France, and other countries flocked to this area, as did some of our ancestors from Montbéliard, the Alsace, and the Palatinate in Germany. Although life in Russia was difficult in the early years, in the later years things were going quite well for the Mennonites. For nearly 100 years, the Russian government lived up to the promise that Catherine the Great had made to the Mennonites. But things were about to change. After 1870, a new Tsar of Russia named Alexander II took a different attitude with the Mennonites than did his predecessors. His aim, which was stated in a decree, was to make full-fledged Russians out of all the Germans living in the empire. The opinion among our ancestors to leave Russia was almost unanimous. But where would they go? A decision was made to settle in the Pembina region of the United States. The Pembina region is centered in the far northeast corner of North Dakota. What was then the Dakota Territory, right next to Canada. Andrew Schrod and 10 other families representing the Zohoritz congregation were ready to go. They decided to go ahead of the rest. When they arrived in New York on May 18, 1874, Schrod was made aware that Daniel Unruh, a friend to one of the delegation parties, had decided to settle north of Yankton in the Dakota Territory. Rather than settling in the Pembina region, our ancestors decided that they too would settle in the Yankton area. So if it was not for Daniel Unruh, many of our ancestors might have settled in the far northeast corner of North Dakota. All of our ancestors arrived in 1874 and departed their ship, with a few exceptions, parted the ship at Castle Garden, which is on the far southern end of Manhattan Island. Many people think it was Ellis Island that we got off, where we got off. Ellis Island had not yet been built in 1874. The second, much larger group of 53 families from the Zohoritz congregation had various delays and hardships. An incident occurred that shortly after crossing the border to Austria that left a bitter feeling among the group, and particularly for one family. Peter Graber, a member of the group, incurred the ill will of a real estate dealer in Russia. Marnette Hofer of the Heritage Hall Museum in Freeman recently told me that there were 31 individuals named Peter Graber in the Freeman area, so this may be an alias. The dealer stated that Mr. Graber refused to swear to a falsehood in connection with the land deal. First of all, most Mennonites were opposed to the idea of swearing to anything. A lawsuit was started against Mr. Graber, and officers were sent from Russia to intercept him and bring him back to face these charges. Completion of this incident was bound to take a few weeks of time, and it was impossible to hold back the entire party. Mr. Graber was also in Austria at the time that this occurred, and there was no legal way that the Russian officers could have forced him to return. Now, if I were the attorney for Mr. Graber, I might have encouraged him to keep going with the group. He had little to lose. But Graber knew that he was innocent, so he decided to leave his wife and 2 small children, which would go with the group, while he went back and settled the matter. The agony of this poor wife and mother to continue the trip alone with the constantly painful thought that she might never see her husband again must have been beyond imagination. Rather than take his would-be attorney's advice, Peter Graber decided to make the sacrifice of going back to obtain an acquittal rather than to proceed as a fugitive from justice. Fortunately, upon the return to Russia, he was promptly acquitted. A few weeks later, Peter Graber was reunited with his family. The immigrants on the second ship got off at Castle Garden in New York on July 27, 1874. Many representatives from various railroads and colonialization companies met them there, including Reverend David Gertz from Kansas, who later became the founder of Bethel College. A few of the immigrants decided to go to Kansas, but the majority decided to join the group that had already located in Yankton. Family names that were represented in the group that settled in the Dakota Territory included Albrecht, Flickinger, Deering, Graber, Kaufman, Miller, Kleinheim, Reese, Schrog, Center, Stuckey, Schwartz, and Walton. The third group, which represented the congregation of Horodish and Waldheim, docked in New York on August 24, 1874. It is believed that this group waited a week in New York until the fourth ship arrived and which carried the congregation of Kotosufka. Approximately 14 families from the Kotosufka group joined those from Horodish and Waldheim and settled in the Freeman Marion area in the Dakota Territory. The remaining members of the Kotosufka group settled in Kansas near Mountain Ridge. Many family stories have been recorded during the time since our ancestors immigrated to the United States. I would only like to mention two. You may be familiar with the first story, but probably not the second. One of the greatest challenges to the Mennonites was how to respond to World War I and World War II. Many of you will probably know the story of John Schrog. I will read the one that James Juhnke submitted to the Mennonite Life in July 1967. John Schrog was a prosperous Mennonite farmer who lived in Harvey County, Kansas. He was a member of the Hopefield Mennonite Church. In 1917, when the United States went to war against Germany, Schrog refused to buy bonds to help pay for the war. Many Mennonites reasoned that war bonds were like taxes. Payment could be seen as rendering unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. Local American patriots put great pressure on German-speaking people who refused military service to make some kind of a contribution to the war. Schrog repeatedly refused the appeal of the local volunteer war bond committee. On November 11, 1918, the day the First World War ended, people in the town of Burton called a holiday and held a big victory celebration. Some fellows set up a casket with a sign that said that the Kaiser, the leader of the German nation, was inside. Instead, there was a dead skunk in the casket. The Burton War Bond Committee decided that this would be a good time to get John Schrog to finally buy some war bonds. They took 5 carloads of men 11 miles out to the Schrog farm and forced John Schrog to come with them. In town, they told him now he had one last chance to buy bonds. He refused. They tried to get him to carry an American flag and lead a parade through town. Someone put a flag to his hand, but he did not take hold of it. It fell to the ground. Someone in the milling crowd shouted, "He stepped on the American flag." The crowd turned into an uncontrollable mob. Someone got a bucket of yellow paint. They poured it over him and rubbed it into his scalp and beard. They took Schrog to a small city jail on Main Street. Someone brought a rope and said that instead of putting Schrog in jail, they should just hang him to a tree. They would have lynched him, except for Tom Roberts, the head of the Burton Anti-Horse Thief Association. Roberts pulled out his gun, got Schrog into the jail, and said, "We are Americans. This man is going to get a fair trial." Some mob members made plans to come back that night, to break into the jail and to hang Schrog after all. But Tom Roberts called the Harvey County Sheriff in Newton. The sheriff drove out and took Schrog to the county jail in Newton. By the next day, Schrog was cleaned up and released. The Burton citizens decided to bring Schrog to court on charges of violating the Espionage Act. That national law, which was later declared unconstitutional, made it a crime to show disrespect to the American flag. After a hearing in Wichita, a federal judge ruled that there was not enough evidence to bring Schrog to trial. The evidence that Schrog had slandered the flag was not convincing. Schrog had been calmly non-resistant during the entire ordeal. Everything that he had said that day was in the German language. None of his accusers could speak or understand German. John Schrog had hired a Jewish lawyer who was from Wichita to defend him in court. The lawyer advised him to take his persecutors to court with a countersuit. There was no doubt that they had violated his rights as a citizen. But Schrog declined to sue his tormentors. That would have gone against Mennonite non-resistant principles. One member of the mob on November the 11th had been Charles Gordon. He was a young dairy farmer who had come into town for the celebration. He couldn't get out of his mind what he had seen and done. 50 years later, in 1968, Gordon recorded on tape an oral history interview about the event. He remembered how non-resistant Schrog had been. I don't know how many people walked right up to him and spit in his face, and he never said a word. He just looked up all the time that we was doing that, possibly praying, I don't know. But there was some kind of a glow come over his face, and he just looked like Christ. Enemy smite you on one cheek, turn the other. And brother, he did it. He just kept doing it. They'd slug him on one side of the face, and he'd turn the other cheek. He exemplified the life of Christ more than any man I ever saw in my life. Charles Gordon said that because of the witness of John Schrog, he became a non-resistant Christian. You mean you became a Mennonite? Asked the interviewer. No, said Gordon. I'm a member of the Nazarene Church. You can be a Nazarene and also be a conscientious objector. The second story concerns my father, and it's also about World War II experience. Before I close, I guess I should thank the Eden Mennonite Church for not kicking my father out of the church. It was under consideration, at least by a few of the members. When I was about 35 years old, my father finally got around to telling me something he thought I should know. And I should probably hear it from him first rather than someone else. He said, Jerry, I wore my military uniform to church one time. Needless to say, I was shocked. Eden Mennonite and most all Mennonite churches have a very strong peace and non-combatant tradition. But 2 world wars and other outside influences had many of the young Eden church members considering military service. During World War II, 68 young men from Eden Mennonite were drafted. Of those, 44 served as conscientious objectors in civilian public service, the option that was officially supported by the Mennonite denomination. 11 others went into military service in non-combatant roles, and 13 into combatant roles. Even among my father's family, ideologies were split. My father's older brother, Ray, did civilian public service, probably much to the delight of his mother. My father joined the Army and was an air traffic controller in North Africa during the overseas portion of his service. I don't know if this was considered a non-combatant position, but he did say that he never fired a gun at anyone. And his younger brother, Roland, did combatant service in the military in Europe. Roland occasionally talked about his military service until someone would ask him if he ever killed anyone. Then he would not talk at all. My father talked occasionally about his military service, but in his closet at home was his military trunk, which is full of various memorabilia. He also belonged to the McPherson Veterans of Foreign Wars organization. At the time that he wore his military uniform to church, the Eden Church Constitution called for the exclusion of any member that participated in military service. But the enforcement of this policy was very lax. After I got over the initial shock of my father telling me about wearing his military uniform to church, I responded, "Dad, what were you thinking?" There was no response. Again, I said a little more forcefully, "Dad, what were you thinking?" Again, there was no response. So I finally asked, "Well, what was the response of the church?" My father said, "Everyone pretty well ignored me." Having spent my younger years at Eden Church and knowing the nature of some of its older members, I could imagine that most people probably did ignore the fact that my father was wearing his military uniform in church. As I later learned, that was not true of everyone. Bill Juhnke Sr., my father's first cousin, felt that the Eden Church should be free from anyone associated with the military. Bill took an active role in the debate over the church's position regarding military service. He had a very strong peace stance and was very much against any Mennonite participating in the military. He prepared a proposed message that he believed should be the church's position on returning military veterans. It read, in part, "You are no longer a Mennonite. We are sorry. We want you to again become a Mennonite. You'll have to leave your Army medals, your Army uniform, and all that. We want you to take communion with us. With your medals and your uniform and the blood of other human beings on your hands, we cannot let you in. You are always welcome to come back, but you will have to repent." Bill's military position proposal did not prevail at Eden. It may have been partly due to one fact in particular. Since 24 Eden members had World War II military service, if the proposal had passed, a significant portion of the congregation would have had to say goodbye to their brothers, cousins, nephews, sons, or grandsons. A very unlikely occurrence. My father stayed at Eden when most others with military service did not. They eventually left. He loved the church and insisted that his sons attend. On the way home from church, he would ask me, "What did the preacher say today?" Dad also taught an Eden adult women's Sunday school class for over 30 years. Both of his sons became conscientious objectors, although neither had to serve. My father never held any animosity towards Bill Juhnke, and neither did Bill's family hold any animosity towards us. In fact, I think that we got along extremely well. I certainly thought very highly of the family. My father also got along very well with his two brothers, as they each did with each other. Someone in the church asked me why my father wore his military uniform to church. Was he trying to promote the military? I truly believe that my father wore the military uniform to church because he felt that he looked handsome in the uniform and that it would impress the eligible young ladies. But I think this backfired on him. I can imagine that any father with an eligible young daughter would have said, "I don't want you dating that Marvin Juhnke," which may help to explain why my mother was from Freeman, South Dakota. Thank you.